Hey everybody, Steven from Dogwood here. In this video I'm going to show you how I made a simple walnut end grain cutting board. I used 3 different boards of walnut to maximize the color variation in the final board. On the table saw, I cut each board into 1.5 inch wide strips, 8 strips in all, which will give me a 12 inch wide cutting board. Then I used my drum sander to clean up the cut surfaces so they would glue together cleanly. I shuffled the strips randomly and glued them together. I used cawls to keep the strips aligned and then clamped the strips together into a panel. The next day, I removed the clamps. I used a plane to remove the excess glue to give me a flat surface reference and planed the panel down to 1.5 inches, which will create squares when the pieces are flipped. I swapped out my table saw blade to a 60-tooth crosscut blade. I set up my crosscut sled to make just over 2 inch wide cuts, which will give me a 2 inch tall cutting board when I glue them together. I got 13 strips out of the panel, which gave me a 19.5 inch board before sanding. I flipped every other strip to give a more random pattern and glued the strips together. I used cawls on the sides to keep the edges of the squares lined up. The next day, I removed the clamps and once again planed off the excess glue. Next, I set up my router sled and flattened the top surface of the board. Then I flipped it over and flattened the other side. I ran the board through the drum sander to remove the router marks. Once the marks were removed, I switched to a higher grit sandpaper. I started at 80 grit and sanded up to 220 grit. There were some natural voids in the walnut, which I filled with sawdust and glue. Then I ran it through the drum sander to sand the glue down. Next, I trimmed the sides of the board on the table saw. I used a box core router bit to make handles on both sides of the board. Now I had to do lots of sanding. I started with a palm sander for the sides and moved to a disc sander for the cutting surfaces. Then I sanded the handle slots by hand. I sanded the edges and corners with a sanding block to keep them square but not sharp. Then I used my branding iron to burn my logo into the side and cleaned it up with sandpaper. And finally, the moment of truth. I soaked the board in mineral oil to protect it from moisture, which really makes the wood look awesome. And there you have it, a simple end grain cutting board. Thanks for watching, and let me know if there's anything you'd like to see next.